Thank you for coming. I know I am keeping you from free beer, and I'm keeping myself from free beer. So I'm going to get a bit of a move on. I've got a lot I want to show you. Okay, so first I'm going to start out with a quick question. What is one of the first things you would tend to look at with a new project? You can try to shout if you like. What's one of the first things you would tend to look at? I could barely hear you, but I heard one word I was looking for. Yeah, I guess it is documentation. And I'm one of these crazy people that likes doing documentation. I come to dev conferences trying to convince developers interesting ways of doing documentation better. And this is one of my presentations. I'm going to start with a couple of little quotes to set the ground. This is actually an interesting quote from Ken Williams, one of the creators of Perl. And this is an old quote. It's not a new quote at all. But we know that this is an ideal, not a reality. The reality is actually often more like this. This is another quote from someone I met from Wikimedia. Yes, documentation is something that we all know we should do, but don't really want to, apart from people like me. So in this presentation, I have a couple of different presentations. In this one, it's going to be about how to automate a lot of this. Just a hodgepodge, crazy bunch of ideas of things to try to automate some of your documentation, or if you like, automate your housework. This is kind of an ongoing project that I've been working with a few people, and there's some GitHub repositories that are in progress with some of the examples where I kind of encourage people to try them, add support for your languages of choice, your systems of choice. Basically, I'm learning. This is a learning process, this presentation in itself. This is a chinchilla, by the way. I was about to say there's too many cats on screens, but there's actually a cat on this screen. But the chinchilla's the main animal in this picture. It's a learning process. There's ideas I've tried with languages that I use in processes that I use. I'm very much open to you telling me some ideas of things you've tried too. Let's get started. I'm going to jump backwards and forwards between lots of demos, so we'll see how they go. First, spelling. Things like spelling and grammar, okay, for me it's more about professionalism. If someone reads documentation in your project and there's spelling errors and typos and things like that, it puts them off. Every little thing that you get wrong puts someone off thinking that this is something they want to try. So how can we automate some spelling? Here's a couple of ideas. Hunspell is pretty well established. It's nothing new. It's actually the spell checker in LibreOffice, OpenOffice, Firefox, Thunderbird, apparently Chrome, and a lot of other things as well. But it's actually an open source project, and you can kind of use it for other things. It's a Linux package, so if you have a Linux distribution, it's just in package repositories or Homebrew if you're a Mac user. And this is kind of an example of the command we could run. And here's where I'm going to try to start jumping into some examples. We're having 3 screens, gets even more confusing. All right, there we go. Is that readable? No, not quite. Okay. So I'm actually using the Docker documentation to work on some examples here. It seemed like a good, reasonably large documentation set to use. So here's our script. This is setting things like the dictionary we want to use. We're going to use English US and some other options, and we're going to check markdown files. And let's see what happens. Oops, this is a good start. Yeah. I actually was smarter than this. I prepared script already, that's why. So this is very useful. You can read all of these spelling errors, you know exactly what it's saying to you, and it's extremely helpful to you. There's a lot of documents here, a lot of potential spelling mistakes, and it's completely unreadable. You could, of course, do all sorts of logging with this to get some ideas, but this isn't very useful. And this is basically because Hunspell is not meant for checking code, so there's a lot of things here that are code, are file names, and many other examples are not very useful to us. So there's actually, though, a sort of a wrapper around Hunspell that's great for Markdown, and there's other equivalents for restructured text and ASCII docs called MD spell, or Markdown spell check. The module is different from the actual command, and it respects the Markdown. So this is a little more useful. Let's have a look. Let's remember the name of my script. Okay. So this is firstly more readable. It's actually giving us line numbers, and it's not giving us suggestions, though. There are flags we can turn on for suggestions, but it's easier to use. You might notice, of course, here that it's marking things that are spelling errors that aren't spelling errors. They're brand names, they're project names, they're technical terms which effectively in proper English are wrong, but they're not wrong. So how can we change that sort of aspect of things? I have an example here. Yeah. So with the MD spell, it's actually quite easy. You can just create a dot spelling file in the location of your repository and add some of the words that you don't want to be considered as spelling errors. And this is, I've just started here, so you can see some examples of some of the words I've put in that Docker uses quite often that are correct. And that's just a file you can obviously share in a repository, share with workmates, things like that, and train the spelling errors. So it's still not great, but it's semi-useful. So what's some of the next steps you could look at? Actually, here, this blog post is a very old blog post, but Hunspell is also very old. And this is actually quite an interesting one where not only can you have that shared text file of spelling errors, words that are not spelling errors, you could actually convert it into a proper dictionary and then use it in the other applications that also use Hunspell. So you could have a shared dictionary of all the acceptable words, not only for your technical documentation, but also for marketing documentation and things like that too. So it's actually quite a cool way to have that resource shared amongst the whole company. You can hook these things up to CI. Whether you want to consider a spelling error breaking a build or not is up to you. I make no judgment. And editors as well. So for example, here I'm using Atom, and Atom has a lot of different packages, but if I make an error here, I actually have to set, so I'm write in multiple different languages. You can see here, it's flagging this as a spelling error. And it's using exactly the same package, and I can share the same dictionary file and all these sorts of things. Okay, what about grammar? Spelling is one thing, but what about actually writing better without having to understand all the rules of vague English? There's a great module that I like to use here called Write Good, another NPM module. You can, again, check Markdown, but also other plain text and structured text files. And it has a bunch of different tests, and you can just run all the tests, or you could run selective tests, or you could run all tests excluding certain tests. And what these tests are is, I won't go into too much detail, but for example, something like a weasel word is a word that doesn't really serve any purpose. And this happens a lot in technical documentation. Or so. So is another classic example of a word in English that everyone uses all the time, and you don't really need it. It doesn't really serve any purpose. So let's have a look at a quick example there. I'm going to just change branch. So this, again, I've wrapped here. So we can again see that this is highlighting potential grammar errors and what it suggests to correct them. This gets a little bit more up to you on how you want to write things, and maybe if you want to spend a bit more time polishing documentation, but it starts to give you some quite nice guidance, which again, you could pipe out into CI systems and logging systems and things like that. And again, in a lot of text editors, this is also available. So it's the same set of problems and suggestions. There's also another one in the Java world, which is language tool, which is used in a lot of Java-based applications, actually. The big issue with it, much like some of the earlier examples, is it doesn't really understand code, doesn't really understand plain text files, links, things like that. So it's semi-useful, but there might be some ways to customize it. There's a lot of Java developers here, so try it if you like. Again, I showed one particular tool, but there's a lot of these around. There's a lot of open source ones, there's a lot of commercial ones. I also am quite a big fan of a tool called Grammarly, which is a sort of web-based application. But unfortunately, a lot of these don't have anything like APIs, so you can't connect them up to continuous integration tools and things like that. So it's not particularly automated, and I don't think they ever will have APIs because they're not really designed for us. They're kind of designed for normal writers, I suppose. But still, if you want a manual step, they add some extra bits of advice there. And there's also a lot of commercial tools, very expensive commercial tools for helping with this too. Okay, let's get onto some of the more interesting things. Screenshots. A picture does indeed say 1,000 words, and screenshots are very useful, especially if you have a GUI-based application of explaining ideas and concepts to people without writing paragraphs of text. But generating screenshots is very, very tedious. And also, when you change a font or you change a style, you have to replace all the screenshots. So surely we can automate them. Of course we can. Again, this is one example. And this example, of course, is web browser based. So this is a web application, but there are similar tools for other sorts of applications. I'm just kind of showing the principles here. So for my example, I've already installed Phantom.js, which is kind of a headless browser. And then I've used a combination of tools related to Selenium and this robot framework that we can define basically test steps, and we can then use those screenshots generated and include them in documentation. I'm going to show you an example first, and then I'll sort of talk about some of the positives and negatives of this. So this is actually a very simple example. I'm going to hope the internet works because I'm going to use a website here. It goes to a particular web page. It attempts to log in. It takes a screenshot of the login box, annotates it, and it continues testing. So I actually know this test is going to fail, but we'll still get the screenshot. So you're already starting to see here that you can actually get a lot of these things part of your existing automation workflows. This is basically using automated tests to generate screenshots for documentation. So it's already part of an existing workflow you have. But let's open this up. Okay, so once we've defined all those files, it's actually a very simple command. It runs, it attempts to connect to the server we've specified. And depending on the internet, see how long it takes. It also, unfortunately, uses jQuery to do all this, so it's a little slow. But it started to try to log in, and actually I noticed that the website I was using to test this, they changed a lot of their structure. So the test is failing, but we still should have a screenshot here with an annotation saying log in here, and it's also got a dotted box around it. So again, we've automatically generated a screenshot quite easily and quickly. And if you have tooling like this already part of your existing continuous integration system, then it's not too hard to take it further. Now, what some of the issues with this, like Python, for example, and restructured text supports this very, very nicely. You can actually embed it all inline in the documentation. Other languages and markup languages are not so well supported, unfortunately. So it often is more of a case of generating the screenshots and just making sure that the file path in the documentation is correct. But I think it's worth the effort, actually. I've sort of spoken to this with a lot of people, and it's one of those sorts of tasks that once you've got it working, it saves you a lot of time in the long run. And people rely on screenshots. So yeah, that's kind of some of the questions to think about. How do you want to set this up? Is it part of your existing testing workflow? Is it separate? Et cetera, et cetera. Testing. Now this is, again, already feeding into some existing workflows you have. How many times have you gone to documentation, read a code example, and it doesn't work, and you've just given up, or tried to find another way? This happens quite a lot, again, because things change, or there were dependencies or things like that that the developer or the writer assumed you had and you don't, and et cetera, et cetera. So in theory, we should test all our code examples too. So let's have a look at a couple of ways of doing that. So if you're just testing APIs, then there's a couple of ways of doing this. Again, this is just one example that I've used in the past, and depending on the language background you come from, there's lots of ways of doing this. And again, of course, testing APIs is probably part of your existing workflow. And if you're generating documentation out of that, then hopefully it's already being tested. But sometimes documentation is kept separate. So you might need to test it in two different places, which is odd, but again, it depends on the company. So this is a tool called Dread from a company called Apiary, and I'm using the Marvel API here just because it's fun to use. It's actually a terrible API, but it's fun for examples. So in this case, it's using a format called API Blueprint, which is an API definition file. It also supports Swagger, which is another one, and I think another one that's name has completely escaped me. It tests that against the API URL, and you have hook files, so you can actually inject your own logic, which I'll show you in a minute. For example, the Marvel API always wants a generated token, hashed token, attached to every request. So I actually use the hook file to generate that. Let's have a look at this. Again, this will fail. This will fail, but I just want to kind of give you an idea of how it works. It's going to start failing for various reasons, mostly because of the Marvel API, but and I don't know who even made this API blueprint file, but you get the idea. I will probably just let it continue there. But how that looks, Dread consists of a configuration file, which has a bunch of different settings. And here's the hooks file, for example. So saying before each request, generate this hash key, because it wants things with a random hash each time. It's a slightly strange API, but yeah. And that's just one example. There's a lot of, this is a very busy space. Testing APIs and also integrating the documentation of them is a very busy space, actually. Lots of commercial and open source options. Jetman is one. Postman, I don't know if you've used Postman. It's actually added a lot of new features that are quite good for sort of mocking APIs and collaborating on that and the documentation and also the testing now. But a lot of commercial options. It's a very, very busy space. APIs are one thing, but what about those code snippets, those code examples? This is actually probably the more interesting one and the more useful one and the harder one to do. So again, I'm going to show you a Python and Sphinx example just because it supports it the best. So Sphinx is a documentation renderer for Python and restructured text, and it has built into it quite a useful tool. I'm going to show you what this looks like in the code. So here's a very simple restructured text file. It actually has this concept of test setup, so we can say the dependencies we need to make the example work, but the reader doesn't need to know about them. So they're hidden. The example, and then the expected result. This is a very simple example, but the only thing that's actually going to display is sum22, and everything else will be tested. So I'll do this. So this runs. It passed the test. And if we look inside the build, no, not that. I've lost the file somewhere. But if we generated the actual restructured text, the output, the HTML, we would just see that too many things going on here. Oops. We would just see this line here. So this is fantastic, this is great, this is super, super useful, super, super cool, but not very useful if you're not doing Python. So, are there any other options? And I will say at the moment, this is kind of the area where there's not that many concrete options. I started working with a QA team at the last company I was working at on two different ways of looking at this. One is extracting all the code snippets from the documentation, building them into an application and testing that. The other way around was creating the example as like JavaScript files or Python files or Java files or whatever they happen to be. So it's a separate application itself and referencing the bits of the code in the documentation instead. This is easier in some, so for example, Markdown can't really handle bringing in snippets of code. Other markup languages can. In the kind of more old school enterprise world of technical documentation with XML-based languages like Data and DocBook, you can actually do this much better. So it kind of depends what setup you have and how important the examples are to you as well. It kind of depends from language to language. So this is kind of one of the areas where my community is quite excited about trying to find ways of making this work better, but no one has ideal solutions yet. Okay, I have 7 minutes. I'm going to run through some bonus material, but I'm just going to break that up very, very quickly by showing some very stupid pictures of some animals. That's a wombat, just to kind of have a quick breather before we get to the bonus material, because with all this time I'm hopefully saving you, you have time to look at pictures of wombats or chinchillas, or here's a chinchilla rolling in a dust bath. Great. Okay, right, let's keep moving. That worked better in my head. So what about generating different formats? Again, if you're using some of the XML-based setups, this actually does it for you. Or if you're not, if you're using plain text to generate things like EPUBs, PDFs, help systems, Pandoc is one of my favorite tools in the world. It's actually, it can even generate Word documents from Markdown, which is very, very useful, and vice versa, which is even more useful. This is an example. I probably won't run through generating it right now. So this is just a bash script, and there's obviously other ways you could do it. It's just an example. I run through all the Markdown files. I use Pandoc with YAML front meta, so just metadata about the text, and some other parameters. When I'm generating the PDF, you have to use LaTeX, which is a whole other conversation, but let's just ignore it for now. And down here, I'm doing HTML, although I've just noticed that I'm also using LaTeX, which it wouldn't be, that's a flag that shouldn't be set. But anyway, it's copying and pasting. And from the Markdown files, it will generate HTML, PDFs. I could also do EPUBs. It has lots of support for setting up things like chapters, tables of contents, how you want to define links, images, all sorts of things. It's actually a very, very cool tool for creating multiple formats. Okay, this has all been very useful, but what about actually in the writing process? So I'm going to encourage the use of things like snippets. I've got an example here from Atom of me setting a shortcut for DFM, and it auto-completes to Docker for Mac. And most decent text editors and IDEs should have support for this, and I kind of encourage you to use it. I've actually set up entire paragraphs of text, like marketing copy that I have to remember should be in every document, and I don't want to write it each time. So just set up a snippet so you can automatically include it each time. So it's worth actually setting up some of these in your first steps if there's things you repeat a lot. On the subject of repetition, here's a kind of going a little bit further. This is a process called transclusion. And again, Some markup languages support this better than others. So things like restructured text have this built in by default, so does DETA and XML. But if you are a Markdown fan, which I kind of am, there's actually a nice little NPM module called Hercule. And if you're familiar with Markdown, you'll notice that this bit of syntax looks pretty similar to a link, but it's a bit different. It's got a colon instead. Obviously, this won't work if you don't have Hercule installed, but basically, it's a reference to another file. You have the input and the output file, and this can be scripted, of course, and it will transclude, as it's called, the external files all into one file. So I found this very, very useful for having repeated bits of text that I only want to update in one place. And it gets kind of weird because you start having documentation with build processes, which makes documentation all of a sudden much more complicated than sometimes it needs to be. But as things become more complicated, it can save you a lot of time in the long run because you only have to change things in one place. Another example of this might be things like placeholders. So here, this is an API kind of application. We have two different environments, a preview environment and a production environment for the API. And we've got placeholder tokens in the documentation that at build time we want to replace with real keys so people can actually try the examples. And this is just using sed to do a similar thing, have a build process that when you generate the documentation, it replaces all those placeholders with real codes that can be auto-generated, pulled from systems, pulled from logins and user accounts, things like that. So again, another nice idea of having one sort of source of truth that can be updated. Okay, that's kind of my run through some very, very crazy ideas and some experiments. If you're interested in trying some more, I've actually written some blog posts around some of these that you can find on that link. Koala is quite a cool tool that tries to bundle a lot of these sort of linting type efforts together. So you can actually have a linter that will lint your Markdown, your file names, your links, all in kind of one command. It's still early days, but it was a Google Summer of Code project, and it's quite promising. Test the Docs is kind of me and a group of people who are trying to get some of these ideas a bit more solidified, and we have a repository with a lot of these examples that you can play around with. If you're more interested in the writing side, then the Docs community has a Slack channel, of course, as everyone else does. And I guess one of the things I kind of like to close this is why bother in the first place? Why bother with good documentation? I mean, I have a whole other talk about this, but I would say that documentation isn't just for developers. It's actually a way of people finding your product or project, understanding what it is. It's a way of business people saying, yeah, you've been working with this tool for 6 months. It's awesome. You say it's great. Okay, they want how much money? Let me have a read about it and see if I understand why it's useful. So not everyone who is a technical person reads documentation, so make it as good as it can be. And in conclusion, thank you very much. You can find all my sorts of work on these websites or on Twitter, and I would say, let's go and have a drink. So thank you very much.